Hello and welcome, sleepy traveler. Tonight, we return to a quieter time. A time before phone screens, schedules, and the constant tick of precision. A time when a slow clock on a crooked wall could still be trusted. When people didn't rush, or if they did so without really knowing the time at all. Let the world slip away. Let your breathing slow. And let me tell you a story, not of danger, nor adventure, but of something quieter. A story about a clock. A clock in an old inn. One that never quite ticked in time with the rest of the world. One that was always, unfailingly, 17 minutes behind. Part 1. The inn at the edge of the map. There once stood an inn at the very edge of a village no one really meant to visit. It wasn't on the way to anywhere in particular. If you arrived there, it meant you had either taken a wrong turn, followed a path too fated to be real, or had been seeking the kind of silence that couldn't be found on any proper road. The inn was called the Mapmaker's Rest, not because any mapmaker had ever stayed there, but because, as rumor had it, if you looked closely at any local map, the ink seemed to curl or fade precisely where the inn should have been. It was as if cartographers, knowingly or not, had collectively agreed to let it slip from memory. It was a squat, three-story structure nestled in the crook of two disused roads, with beams that leaned ever so slightly to the left. Like the building was forever in conversation with the wind. The roof was tiled in old slate, with patches of moss that never dried. Even in summer, the windows, thick with bubbled glass, were always just foggy enough to conceal the inside, no matter how bright the lanterns burned within. The sign above the door bore a compass rose, hand-painted and weathered by rain. Oddly, the compass's needle always pointed west, even when the wind screamed from the north or the storms rolled in from the south. It creaked softly when the breeze passed, like it was sighing from too many forgotten years. Inside, the floors groaned with memory. Not just the occasional creak of age, but a consistent, rhythmic complaint, as though the very wood remembered every step taken, every secret shared near the hearth. The scent inside was one of chimney smoke, rain-damp stone, and something floral but faint, like dried lavender that had been stored in drawers too long. And in the center of the common room, just above the hearth, hung the clock. It was a simple thing, a circular wooden frame, a cream-colored face, Roman numerals etched deep and dark. Its hands, made of blackened iron, moved in silence. No tick, no talk, but anyone who cared to watch would soon notice. The time was always wrong. It was, without fail, 17 minutes behind. Not 15, not 20, 17. Always. No matter how many times the innkeeper wound it. No matter how often traveling merchants, clockmakers, or curious guests tried to fix it. The clock would hold steady for an hour or so. And then, with unbothered inevitability, it would fall gently, precisely, back to its slow rhythm. People talked about it. Some laughed. Some complained. One man once missed the mail coach and swore never to return. But those who stayed, those who returned, learned something strange. Things felt different here. Time stretched in peculiar ways. Teacups stayed warm longer than they should have. Fires in the hearth seemed to take longer to fade. Conversations unraveled slowly, gently, like a ball of yarn that never quite reached its end. Books didn't seem to finish. Sleep came easier. Dreams lingered. And that clock, always 17 minutes behind, didn't feel wrong. It felt safe. Aldrin, the innkeeper, never explained the clock. He was a tall, quiet man with weathered hands and a habit of polishing the bar even when it didn't need polishing. He wound the clock each evening, exactly at sundown, said nothing, and walked away. It was as if he trusted the clock more than he trusted time itself. And perhaps he was right. Because in the Mapmaker's Rest, people didn't arrive when they planned to. They arrived when they were supposed to. And they always arrived 17 minutes late. Part 2. The guests who stayed, and never really left. There was something about the Mapmaker's Rest that made people linger. Not just in the way you might linger after a good meal or a quiet night by the fire. But something deeper. A slow drifting hesitation that settled into the bones. Travelers would arrive with intent, on their way to somewhere else, but after a night or two, their urgency would dissolve like steam off the kettle. They would sit longer at breakfast, take slower walks through the village, and forget to ask for the bill. It wasn't that they were trapped. The road was still there, winding off into the hills. muddy or dusty depending on the season. No one locked the doors. No strange enchantment or spectral fog kept anyone from leaving. And yet, most didn't. They stayed. Sometimes for weeks. Sometimes longer. There were records, barely, of a man named Rupert Gray, who came in 1847 on his way to deliver medical supplies to a mining camp 3 towns over. He stayed the night at the inn, intending to rise early. Instead, he lingered for tea, then for supper, then for weeks. He sent a letter explaining the delay. But no one at the camp ever saw him again. A year later, his name appeared in the local census, listed under occupation, gardener. He never gardened, as far as anyone could tell. But he seemed content enough trimming hedges that didn't grow and watering soil that never dried. There was also Miss Arabelle Clark, a schoolteacher from a city no one could quite remember. She had boarded the mail coach for a job in the capital. When the wheel cracked near the inn, she stayed the night. The coach was repaired. The driver beckoned, but Arabelle shook her head and stayed. For 40 years, she kept the library in the back corner of the inn's common room in immaculate condition. She catalogued books no one read. She cleaned shelves no one dusted. She kept time by the old clock, which always ran 17 minutes slow. The inn didn't collect rent. It never grew crowded. New guests came, and others drifted. Some returned to the world outside, dazed and blinking, unsure of how much time had passed. Others simply faded into the rhythm of the place. There was a journal, kept in a drawer behind the counter, where each guest could sign their name and reason for staying. Most didn't bother with the reason. Some wrote odd notes, waiting for the thunder to stop. It never stormed that week. Following the cat, there was no cat. 17 is safe. No elaboration. She said to meet her here. She never said when. Aldrin, the innkeeper, didn't ask questions. He was never surprised if someone arrived wet from the rain and said nothing. He offered tea and a towel. If someone wandered in with a suitcase full of broken clocks, as one guest once did, he simply pointed to the room at the top of the stairs and said, "Second door on the left." Every night, Aldrin wound the old clock. He'd stop polishing glasses or stacking firewood, pull the little chain gently, and wait. The clock would chime once. Not loudly, but clearly, like a polite cough in an empty room. Then it would begin its slow, patient march, but never quite in step with the rest of the world. And no one ever minded. Time here wasn't kept. It was simply noticed. If the clock had been fast, people might have hurried. If it had been precise, they might have planned. But 17 minutes behind? That was just enough delay to let the world pass by, without missing a thing. Part 3. The library no one finished exploring. Tucked behind a narrow door near the rear of the common room, a door most guests assumed led to a pantry or linen closet, was the library. It wasn't listed on any inn pamphlet or mentioned by Aldrin unless someone asked. And even then, he simply gestured vaguely toward the back without fanfare. The room was long, dim, and lined with tall shelves that reached almost to the ceiling. The shelves were unevenly packed, some stuffed with volumes too deep, others half empty with gaps like missing teeth. The floor was a patchwork of mismatched rugs, threadbare but clean. A single round window at the far end of the room let in a sliver of pale light. Though it always seemed to be dusk inside the library, regardless of the hour, there was no catalog system, no alphabetizing, no genres marked. And yet, those who browsed often found exactly what they didn't know they were looking for. Some books had titles, others didn't. A few were blank when opened but filled with words the next time. One book, entirely in French, was found open on a chair for years, though no guest ever admitted to reading French. Another bore only a title, The Clock's Humble Argument, and inside. Each page contained a single sentence: "It is not the minutes that matter, but the moments," repeated over and over, more than 400 times. Miss Arabelle Clark, the former schoolteacher, had once tried to organize the shelves. She spent months at it, labeling sections, stacking books by size, even trying to map the room. But within days, the labels would fall off. The books would return to new positions. A thick red dictionary she once placed beside the entrance turned up the next morning on a windowsill, open to a page about delay. In the corner nearest the fireplace, a large leather chair sat angled just so, the kind of angle that let you see the window and the fire at once. But not the door. Many guests found themselves in that chair without meaning to. Some only intended to glance at a book. But hours passed unnoticed. A couple once sat in the library together. A man in boots with a traveling sack. And a woman in a green shawl. They each read quietly, occasionally reaching out to touch hands without looking away from their pages. When they finally spoke, the sun had set, the fire had gone out, and the inn had grown silent. "How long have we been here?" the woman asked. The man blinked, looked around, and said, "I think I forgot what day it was." They didn't seem alarmed, only curious. The library was like that. You never quite felt like you had permission to be there. But you never felt like you were intruding either. It welcomed without invitation, offered without explanation. Time moved gently inside, not forward exactly, but around, like the slow swirl of leaves in a windless room. And just above the mantel in the library, because yes, there was a second fireplace there, was a second clock. Not as large as the one in the common room, but nearly identical. And it, too, was always 17 minutes slow. Guests who noticed both clocks often wondered if they were connected. A few tried winding one and watching the other. But they behaved independently, and yet, remained perfectly in sync. Always wrong together. Always behind by the same amount. Arabelle once theorized, in her own hand-bound journal, that the library clock was simply echoing the first. But after she saw both of them pause, just once, for a full minute before resuming their quiet, mismatched ticking, she stopped writing about them altogether. Instead, she spent her time reading books she never remembered picking up, taking notes she never shared, and falling asleep in that leather chair, always just before the sentence she was waiting for. At the mapmaker's rest, the library didn't need to make sense. It only needed to be there. Like the clock, like the silence, like the sense that somewhere, beyond the bookshelves, time was still trying to catch up. Part 4: The Fire That Never Went Out. In most inns, the fireplace is a matter of comfort, tradition, and sometimes necessity. A place to warm fingers, toast bread, or dry damp boots. But in the mapmaker's rest, the fire was something else entirely. It never truly went out. Not in the way fires normally do, with smoke rising, coals blackening, and a faint hiss as embers surrender to the cold. No, this fire lived in a state of gentle persistence. It didn't roar or blaze, didn't crackle loudly or throw off dangerous sparks. It simply glowed, softly, endlessly. Whether the weather outside was freezing sleet or midsummer drizzle, the hearth was always the same, a modest flicker of orange and gold, casting long shadows on the stone floor, warming the knees of anyone who happened to sit near it for a little too long. Guests often remarked on it. "Strange," they'd say, "I don't remember anyone tending the fire." And they were right. No one ever saw Aldrin add wood. There was a pile stacked neatly beside the hearth. Yes, well cut and dry, but it never seemed to shrink. On rare occasions, guests tried tossing a log onto the fire themselves. Some said the flame accepted it, curling politely around the fresh wood. Others claimed the fire ignored their offerings completely, continuing to burn as it always had, as if it didn't require fuel at all. A carpenter once stayed at the inn during a season of rain. He had a way of measuring things, even when he didn't mean to, counting footsteps, clock ticks, and how long a candle lasted before guttering. After 4 nights beside the fire, he sat back with a puzzled look and muttered to no one in particular, "That hearth hasn't changed heat once. It's like it's breathing at the same pace. Always." He left early the next morning, having built a small replica fireplace in his journal sketches, one he never tried to build again. Arabelle once speculated that the fire was tied to the clock. "They both resist change," she said aloud, though to whom, no one knew. One refuses to be on time. The other refuses to be done. And indeed, the fire and the clock seemed to share a rhythm. When the clock's minute hand made its slow journey to the 12, the flames would stir just a little, a flutter, a sigh, like the logs were listening. And when the hand dropped down again, the fire would settle. There was a chair beside the hearth, low, wide, and upholstered in red velvet faded nearly to rose. No one remembered when it arrived. It didn't match the rest of the furniture, but it felt right where it was. People didn't fight over it. They didn't even rush to sit in it. But once there, they often sat for hours, reading, thinking, or nothing at all. One boy, perhaps no older than 12, once stayed at the inn with his grandfather, while the older man napped upstairs. The boy sat in that velvet chair, staring at the flames. After a while, he asked Aldrin, "Does it ever get bored?" Aldrin looked up from his polishing and asked, "What?" "The fire." The boy said, "It just stays. Isn't it tired?" The innkeeper smiled, not kindly or mockingly, but with the patience of someone who had heard many strange things and found all of them equally possible. "I think," Aldrin said, "it's waiting for someone to say thank you." And with that, he returned to wiping down the bar. The boy never told anyone about the whisper he heard that night. Just as he was falling asleep, a sound like wood shifting, or breath, or words from the fire itself. He dreamed of warmth, of books with blank pages, and of clocks without chimes. And when he awoke, the fire was still burning. Exactly the same, exactly 17 minutes slow. Part 5. The guests who slept through the storm. Storms didn't come often to the village where the mapmaker's rest stood. The hills and trees absorbed much of the wind before it ever reached the inn. And the rain, when it came, arrived like an afterthought. Soft and steady, rarely more than a murmur on the roof. But every once in a while, the clouds would gather in thick, quiet protest, and the sky would flatten to a gray so dense it seemed to weigh down the entire valley. On those rare nights, thunder rolled in slow, patient intervals, as if even the storm respected the pace of the inn. It was on one such evening that the guests arrived. Not with great commotion. There were no galloping horses, no frantic knocks, just the steady creak of the door opening, and a pair of travelers stepping inside with damp cloaks and quiet eyes. They were older, though not elderly, a man and a woman, married perhaps, or simply long acquainted. He carried a violin case. She held a small, square tin box with a floral pattern nearly worn away. Aldrin looked up from behind the bar, nodded once, and said, "Room 4's warm." They thanked him in near unison. No one asked for names. No payment was exchanged. The fire in the hearth gave a soft sigh, and the couple climbed the stairs as the rain began to tap against the glass like a polite reminder of the outside world. Room 4 was small but well kept. A brass bed with a patchwork quilt, a window with thick curtains, and a writing desk that sloped slightly to the left. There was, of course, a clock on the wall, not ornate, but familiar, and yes, 17 minutes slow. The woman placed her tin box on the windowsill and didn't open it. The man set the violin case gently on the bed but didn't unlatch it. They undressed, folded their clothing carefully, and lay down side by side. Not in silence, exactly, but in something more restful than words. And they slept, through the thunder, through the wind, through the faint tremble of window panes and the low hum of the ticking clock. They did not wake for breakfast, nor for tea. They slept for 3 days. Aldrin checked in quietly, once each morning, finding them exactly as they had been, peaceful, untroubled, unmoving. On the 4th morning, they awoke, came downstairs, asked if it had rained. Aldrin, without looking up, simply said, "It passed." They nodded. The woman took her tin box. The man retrieved his violin. They stayed one more night. And the next morning, they left, but not before leaving something behind. In the corner of the common room, near the fire, a small table now held the tin box, unopened, beside a note written in looping, deliberate handwriting. "For the next ones, when they're ready, let it be slow." Guests noticed the box. Some opened it. Inside were dried petals, a hand-drawn map of a town no one recognized, and a tiny brass key without a lock. The violin, it turned out, had been left too, behind the bar, next to the wine rack no one touched. No name, no label, just a note tucked inside the case that read. The storm made it sound better. Occasionally, when the wind outside picked up and the fire swayed in its hearth, guests said they could hear a soft note hanging in the air, not played, but remembered, like a song someone once heard in a dream and never quite forgot. Aldrin never played the violin, never opened the box, never asked who they were or where they went. But from that night forward, the thunder never seemed as loud, and storms passed with a little more kindness. And the clock? Still 17 minutes behind, but in that pause between lightning and thunder, some swore you could hear it tick just a little louder. Just once, then quiet again, as if it, too, had listened to the music. Part 6. The Clockmaker Who Never Claimed His Work. There was a time when a man visited the mapmaker's rest who seemed, at first glance, perfectly ordinary. His name, according to the signature in the guest book, was Thaddeus Meyer. He arrived without luggage, only a small velvet pouch tied with a braided cord and a leather roll of tools tucked beneath one arm. His coat was thick with road dust, and his hands, though clean, bore the permanent stain of oil and brass. He said little when he entered, merely nodded once to Aldrin, glanced around the room, and took a seat by the hearth. The fire shifted slightly when he approached, as if adjusting to make space. He did not ask for a room, but one was made ready. He did not order a drink, but tea appeared beside him. Black, without sugar, still hot, though no one remembered brewing it. It wasn't until the second evening that he spoke. "You've 8 o'clock," he said to Aldrin, his voice low and even. "That prefers to be late." Aldrin, who was wiping down the countertop with a familiar rhythm, simply nodded. Thaddeus sipped his tea, then added, "I know that clock. I made 3 like it. Long ago. One was lost to a fire. The other, I never found. And the third, well, it was never purchased." A pause passed between them like a shadow across a window. "I left it behind," Thaddeus continued, "in a shop that doesn't exist anymore." Aldrin didn't ask questions. He never did. Thaddeus stood, reached into his pouch, and withdrew a small brass key, not much larger than a thumbnail, but cut with intricate notches along its sides. "This," he said, setting it gently on the bar, "was meant to regulate the delay. But perhaps it was better without it." He did not elaborate. Instead, he walked upstairs and retired to his room, number 7. A quiet corner suite with slanted ceilings and a window that faced nothing in particular. No one saw him leave the next morning. In fact, no one saw him again. But the key remained. For a time, it sat quietly on the bar, until one day it vanished, not lost, not taken, simply gone. Some said Aldrin had put it away. Others believed it had simply fulfilled its purpose and faded like a dream. And the clock? It ticked on, still 17 minutes slow, though now, guests noticed a subtle change. Once every so often, perhaps once a week, or maybe once every few years, the clock would pause. Just for a second, a flicker in the minute hand's movement, a hesitation, as though it remembered someone who had touched it once. Long ago, Arabelle found Thaddeus's name in the guest book months later. Half faded and written in thin, careful script, she copied it into her own notes. Beneath a heading that read, "Artifacts of Deliberate Delay." It was one of many names she kept there, alongside sketches of keys, winding mechanisms, and the strange silence between chimes. No one knew where Thaddeus had gone, but some believed he had not gone far. A boy once claimed he saw a man fixing a broken pocket watch in the forest near the village, seated on a mossy log with his tools spread like an altar. He said the man looked up, nodded once, and said, "It's not broken, just resting," then vanished between the trees. No one confirmed the story. No one needed to, because when the wind blew through the halls of the mapmaker's rest, guests sometimes heard a faint, metallic sound, a gear clicking into place, a spring coiling tight, and then the familiar tick. Slow, steady, 17 minutes behind, just as it was always meant to be. Part 7. The girl who counted the chimes. She was perhaps 8 years old when she first arrived at the mapmaker's rest. Small for her age, with thick black hair tied in a fraying ribbon and a jacket several sizes too big, which made her look like she was trying to disappear into the sleeves. Her name was Elsie. She came with no parents, no siblings, and no luggage apart from a cloth bundle that clinked faintly when she moved. She didn't speak when she arrived. Aldrin found her sitting by the fireplace one rainy morning in early autumn, feet tucked under her on the red velvet chair. She had mud on her boots and a faint trace of soot on her cheek, as if she had been walking through chimney ash or forgotten corners of the village. She stared at the clock, not fearfully, not curiously, just knowingly. When asked where she'd come from, she only shrugged. When offered tea, she nodded and drank in silence. It wasn't until her third day at the inn that she spoke. Standing at the base of the stairs, looking up at the great clock in the common room. "Do you know it skips the 7th chime?" she said. Aldrin, polishing a row of mismatched glasses, turned slightly. "Does it?" She nodded. "It never strikes 7. It just hums a little, like it's shy." From that day on, she began keeping a notebook, a tiny thing with stiff pages and a pencil barely longer than her thumb. She filled it with notations, tallies, times, brief descriptions like, clock sighed at 3:12, and wind changed when second hand twitched. No one taught her how. She simply knew how to listen. She became the inn's unofficial timekeeper. Not because anyone needed one, but because she needed to. Each morning, she sat beneath the clock with her bundle beside her, counting each chime as the hours passed. But never 7. Never. She asked questions no one else thought to ask. Why does it chime louder on Thursdays? Why do people yawn more just after the half-hour mark? Why does the fire always flicker just before the minute hand reaches the 3? A guest once joked, maybe the clock's broken, and no one told it. Elsie didn't laugh. She only looked up from her notes and said, "It's not broken. It's considerate." When asked what she meant, she replied, "It's letting the moments catch up." Some began to notice that time really did feel different when Elsie was around. The tea stayed warmer. The rain paused longer before hitting the windows. Guests felt calmer, as if the clock ticked more gently just for her. On her 10th night, she left her cloth bundle on the bar. Inside were small, polished stones, each one etched with a Roman numeral. All except one. That one simply bore a circle, unbroken and smooth. Aldrin kept them in a glass jar on the mantel, beside the clock. When asked what they were for, he said only, she said they were seconds she saved. And he believed her, because the day she left, without a sound, without a goodbye, the clock did something it had never done before. It struck 7, clear and low, once, just once, then resumed its usual rhythm. Still 17 minutes slow, but that 7th chime echoed through the beams of the old inn, through the teacups and library books and flickering firelight, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. And in that brief, impossible note, everything felt exactly on time. Part 8. The room that wasn't on the floor plan. At the mapmaker's rest, most guests stayed in one of the 8 numbered rooms that lined the 2nd and 3rd floors. They were all modest, comfortably worn, and faintly scented with lavender and old books. Room 3 had the softest mattress. Room 5 had a view of the garden, though no one could recall seeing anyone tend it. Room 8's a window never opened, but let in the best light. And then there was room 9, which no one ever booked, because it wasn't listed, not in the inn's worn guest book, not on the faded paper floor plan posted behind the bar, and not in Aldrin's memory, or at least, not that he admitted, but it was there. Sometimes, guests had stumbled across it by accident, usually late at night, after waking from a restless dream or following the sound of soft tapping that echoed down the hallways like footsteps just out of sync. It was always at the end of a hallway that didn't used to be there, or behind a door that had always been a broom closet, or tucked in the bend of a staircase that never curved before. The door was plain, dark wood, no knob, just a small brass number 9 affixed slightly off-center. It opened easily. Inside, the room was still. Not empty, not furnished, somewhere in between. There was always a bed, though it looked different each time. Sometimes a 4-poster draped in velvet. Other times, a narrow cot beneath a skylight no one remembered existing. There was always a chair. And a clock, a third one. Silent and motionless. But the oddest thing of all was the mirror. Oval-shaped, framed in tarnished silver, and always just slightly tilted. The mirror never reflected what it should have. Not exactly. Sometimes, it showed the room as it had been moments earlier, a kind of delayed memory, where a guest might still see themselves standing even after they'd sat down. Other times, it reflected things no one could explain. A hand resting on the doorknob, though no one stood there. The clock's hands moving forward, but only in the mirror. Or, in one case, a letter resting on the bed with a guest's name written in handwriting they recognized as their own. One guest, a history teacher named Mr. Elkins, stayed in room 6 but found room 9 when he followed a breeze that shouldn't have existed. He entered, sat down, and began to write in his journal. He later claimed the room, wrote back. Words appeared on the page beside his own, quiet corrections. Sometimes full sentences, not from a ghostly presence, but as though the room itself was editing him, rewriting him. He didn't stay the night. When he returned to his assigned room, the hallway to room 9 was gone. He tried to tell Aldrin. Aldrin only asked, "Did you thank it?" "For what?" Elkins asked. "For showing you something true." No one could agree what room 9 was. Some believed it was where the inn kept its lost time, the 17 minutes that never quite belonged to the day. Others thought it was a leftover part of the original structure, forgotten by builders but remembered by the building. And a few simply called it the reminder. Of what? They could never quite say. But everyone who found it walked a little slower afterward, spoke a little softer, looked at their reflection with more patience, and perhaps a touch more forgiveness. And though the clock in that room never moved, it always pointed to the same time. 7:17. No ticking, no talk, just a moment suspended, like a breath you haven't let out yet, like a door that may, or may not, be waiting for you to find it again. Part 9. The teacup that was always full. In a quiet cabinet beside the fireplace, the one that most assumed held extra napkins or forgotten sugar spoons, sat a single teacup. It was a delicate thing. Porcelain, hand-painted in faded blues and greens, with the faintest gold rim curling around the lip. The paint had chipped in places, and a fine crack ran from the base up one side, but it never leaked. The saucer beneath it was mismatched, heavier, sturdier, with a rougher glaze and a pattern that looked like rain drawn in miniature. No one remembered placing the cup there. Not Aldrin, not Arabelle, not even the clockmaker, who had once paused near it and said quietly, "That wasn't mine." And yet, there it stayed, centered precisely on the middle shelf. Never dusty, never disturbed, and always full. Not brimming, not steaming, just full. With tea, a warm amber color, no visible steam, no scent, but somehow, guests knew it was tea. Not coffee, not cider, not rainwater. Tea. It was said that once. A curious guest, a traveling poet with more notebooks than coin, picked up the cup to examine it. He intended only to lift it and admire the glaze. But when his hand touched the handle, he stopped. He stared for a long moment, then sat, and cried. Not loudly, not in anguish, but with the quiet kind of tears that come from remembering something gentle you thought you'd lost. When asked later what had happened, he could only say, "I remembered the last time someone made me tea without asking." After that, few tried to touch it, but many sat near it. They said it gave off a kind of peace, a soft pressure behind the eyes that made blinking slower, sighs deeper, and arguments impossible. On certain evenings, when the inn was quiet and the fire was low, guests reported hearing a faint clink, the sound of a spoon stirring gently, though no one stood nearby. Once, Elsie, before she disappeared, left a note beside it, folded carefully. "To whoever keeps it full, thank you. I don't drink it, but I like knowing it's there." Another time, someone placed a sugar cube on the saucer. It was gone by morning. Some believed the teacup belonged to the inn itself, that it had been poured once, long ago, by someone who cared deeply, and that the care itself had never evaporated. Like the flame in the hearth, like the ticking of the clock, the tea simply endured. Aldrin never spoke of it. But once, during a long winter night when the wind howled like wolves down the chimney flues, he sat across from it. He didn't touch it, didn't speak, just sat, and in the flicker of firelight, the shadow of the cup moved. Not the cup, just the shadow, as if someone, somewhere, had lifted it, and toasted, not to the future, not to fortune, but to the quiet, to the stillness between minutes, to the pause that mattered more than the hour. And as always, the clock above the mantel ticked on, 17 minutes behind, but perfectly, unfailingly. Content. Part 10. The postcards that had no address. In a shallow drawer beneath the front desk at the mapmaker's rest, hidden just behind a loose panel of cedar, was a stack of postcards. They were old, not crumbling, but aged like paper left in the sun too long. The edges were slightly curled. The ink had faded to the shade of worn denim. Each card bore a watercolor landscape, a winding road through foggy hills, a seaside cliff, a narrow cobbled street lined with shuttered windows. No location was ever named. No country, no city, just brushstrokes and sky. And on the back, in different hands and different inks, a single line, always just one. Some were wistful. "The bread here tastes like memory." Some mysterious. "They told me not to ask about the window, so of course I did." Others more poetic. 17 birds, no more, no less, always before noon, but none bore an address. No stamps, no recipients, just words, sent by no one. To no one, for reasons unclear. Guests didn't discover the postcards all at once. They would turn up, slowly. One folded into the pages of a book in the library. Another beneath a teacup on the porch. A third slipped between the layers of a clean bedsheet. Some believed Aldrin placed them there. He never admitted it. When asked, he would say only, "Some messages want to be found." That's all. There was one guest, a quiet woman named Marin, who found 7 postcards during her week-long stay. She didn't read them aloud. She copied the lines into her notebook, drew careful borders around each, and added a single note at the bottom of the page. I think they're from the same person, just different times. On her last day, Marin left her own card. She propped it against the clock in the common room. It had no image, just a blank front, faintly tea-stained, and on the back, in delicate cursive, she wrote, "I waited 17 minutes longer." That was enough. Aldrin found it in the morning and tucked it into the drawer with the others. And then, something curious happened. From that day forward, guests began leaving their own. Not intentionally, perhaps, but when the drawer was opened now and then, always by accident. Always with surprise, there were more. Dozens. Handwriting no one recognized. Messages in languages half forgotten. Some in pencil, others in blue ink, one even pressed in charcoal. And always just a sentence. Never more. The drawer never overflowed. No card was ever repeated. No one saw anyone write them. But they were there. Stories told in fragments. In pauses. In the space where explanation used to be. One card read, "It's always 17 minutes, but I never mind anymore." Another, "He forgave me here, I think, in his own way. And perhaps most haunting of all, this place remembers better than I do." Guests continued to find them. Some kept the cards. Others left them where they were. A few wrote their own. Hesitantly, unsure of what to say until the words were already on the paper. And all the while, the great clock ticked on. Not fast, not quite slow, just late enough to let a message arrive that otherwise would have been too late. 17 minutes behind, and somehow, always on time. Part 11. The window that faced nothing. Room 2 was, by most accounts, unremarkable. It had a single bed with a worn quilt in muted greens, a nightstand with a brass lamp that hummed faintly when lit, and a wardrobe that creaked whenever opened, even if there was no wind. The floor slanted slightly to the east, causing marbles to roll gently under the bed if dropped. Guests noted it, chuckled, and forgot it soon after. But the strangest thing about room 2 was its window. It faced nothing, not a wall, not another building, just nothing. Looking through it didn't show darkness, nor light, nor clouds or trees or stars. It wasn't black, it wasn't white, it was absence, a quiet, colorless stillness that didn't feel quite empty, but didn't feel full either. Like looking at the pause between notes in a song, or at the silence before a question is answered. Guests didn't notice it at first. They'd arrive, unpack, perhaps admire the wood grain of the bedpost or the scent of lavender tucked in the pillowcase. But eventually, almost inevitably, they'd approach the window and stop. One guest described it as looking at the space between two thoughts. Another said, "It reminded me of something I forgot, or something that forgot me." No one opened the window. It had no latch, no hinges, just a thin pane of glass that, when tapped, didn't echo. Arabelle once spent 3 nights in room 2. Documenting what she saw, her notes began structured, clinical. Day 1. No visible horizon. No discernible light source. Not oppressive. Simply, unavailable. But over time, her notes shifted tone. Day 2. 3:17 a.m. I felt like I blinked and missed a year. Day 3. The window is not showing me the outside. I think it's showing me time before something happened. On the 4th morning, she moved rooms without explanation. When asked, she only said, "It's not a bad window. Just not a window meant for questions." And yet, people kept returning to room 2. One man checked in for a weekend and sat in the armchair facing the window for 18 straight hours. When he rose, he wrote a single line in the margins of the guest book. "I forgave her." He left the next morning without breakfast. Once, during a thunderstorm, lightning struck near the inn, so close that the walls trembled and the lamps flickered. In every room, the lights blinked out for several seconds. Except room 2. In room 2, the light held steady, not bright, not warm, but constant. like the space beyond the window had borrowed the storm's pause and stretched it. Aldrin never spoke of the window. But when asked if he'd ever looked through it, he said only, once, then returned to his quiet tasks. When pressed, he added, "It's not for me anymore." No one knew what that meant. But perhaps, not everything at the mapmaker's rest was meant to be known. Some things were meant to be sat with. Like the old armchair in room 2. Like the cup in the cabinet. Like the clock that, even here, ticked softly, its hands turning ever so slowly toward a time no one waited for. 17 minutes behind, and somehow, exactly where it needed to be. Part 12. The man who asked for the wrong room. He arrived just before dusk. Not late enough to be suspicious. Not early enough to be memorable. He wore a brown wool coat, weather-stained boots, and a dark green scarf that looked older than he did. His face was unreadable, not unfriendly. Just undecided, like he hadn't quite settled into himself yet. He stepped inside the mapmaker's rest and approached the counter where Aldrin stood polishing a glass that was already clean. "I'll take room 7, the man said. Aldrin paused. Then, gently, without judgment, replied, "That room is empty, but not available." The man blinked. "But you said it's empty." Aldrin nodded. "It is, but it's not ready for someone new." There was a long silence. Most guests, at that point, would have shrugged and chosen another room. But not this man. He leaned forward slightly, voice low. "I need room 7. I was told it would be waiting." Aldrin didn't ask who had told him. He didn't ask why. He simply tilted his head toward the ledger and said, "Room 4 is warm, if that's any comfort." The man hesitated, just long enough for the clock above the fireplace to tick once, a soft, deliberate sound that filled the space between their breaths. Then he nodded. Room 4. Then, that night, he did not come down for supper. Guests mentioned hearing quiet footsteps above them. Not hurried, just continuous, as if someone were pacing in a slow, methodical loop. The next morning, the man appeared in the common room. Circles under his eyes, his scarf slightly askew. He didn't sit, didn't eat, just stood near the fire and said, "There's a door in room 4. Small, hidden behind the wardrobe." Aldrin nodded once. "There is." The man seemed unsurprised. "It's locked." "Yes," said Aldrin. "For now." The man stared into the flames, then turned. "But it opens eventually?" Aldrin didn't answer. Later that day, the man left for a walk. He returned just before sunset, carrying a stone, smooth, round, no markings. He placed it gently on the mantel beside the old teacup and said nothing. That night, he tried again to open the hidden door. The next morning, he asked Aldrin, "Have others found it?" "They have." "Did they open it?" "Some did." "What's behind it?" Aldrin gave a quiet sigh. "Something different for everyone." The man stayed 5 more nights. Each night, the same, footsteps, silence, and the occasional creak of old hinges that never fully opened. On the 6th morning, he left. No farewell, no payment, just his name in the ledger, written in neat block letters, E. Moreland. And beside it, in a different hand, not Aldrin's, not the man's, appeared a second note. Days later, room 7 is ready now. No one saw who wrote it. No one stayed in room 7 that week. But one guest, passing the door on the 2nd floor, paused. The number on the plaque shimmered faintly, not glowing, but shifting, like wet ink in fading light. And inside the room, beyond the locked door behind the wardrobe, the hidden handle turned. Not fully, just enough to whisper, "You came at the right time." Even if it was, as always, 17 minutes late. Part 13. The letter that arrived too late, and exactly on time. It was a rainy afternoon when the letter appeared. Not delivered by post, not handed in by a courier with wet boots and a dripping satchel. No one knocked at the door. No one passed the gate. And yet, there it was. Folded neatly, sealed with dark green wax, resting precisely in the center of the front desk, on top of the ledger. Aldrin noticed it first. He didn't seem surprised. He simply looked at it for a long while, as though trying to remember if he had already read it, or was still waiting to begin. He didn't open it. Instead, he placed it beneath a small paperweight, a smooth river stone with the number 17 carved into it, and left it there. Guests noticed. Some asked, "What is it? Who's it for?" Aldrin only answered once, "For someone who doesn't know they're waiting." Days passed. The letter remained. Its envelope slowly curled at the corners from the in's soft, ever-present humidity. The wax seal, though never cracked, began to flake slightly, as if preparing to surrender its contents to the air. A man named Gregory, an amateur historian staying in room 3, studied it for hours. He'd once worked in archives. He said the handwriting was early 20th century, maybe earlier, but when he tried to read the faint words through the paper, he saw something stranger. "It's changing," he whispered. No one believed him, until others began to notice the same thing. One morning, the envelope bore the initials ML. The next day, they had vanished, then returned again. Different initials. JEAS, no one, mine. And still, the letter was never opened. Until she arrived. A young woman, perhaps 30, hair in a braid that looked hurried, shoes caked with city dust. She entered the inn just as the storm cleared, not after. But during that quiet space when the last drops fall reluctantly and the clouds begin to break. She paused just inside the door, looked around, saw the letter, froze. Aldrin said nothing, just gestured slightly with his chin. The woman approached. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the paperweight, moved it aside, and lifted the letter. She didn't ask permission. She opened it. The wax broke with a soft crack, not loud, but definite, like a page turning in a long-forgotten book. She read silently. No tears, no smiles, just stillness. Then she folded the letter again, resealed it with a finger pressed against the softened wax, and placed it back on the desk. When she turned to leave, Aldrin asked only one question. Was it too late? She paused at the door, then said, softly, almost kindly, no, it was 17 minutes late, which is all the time I needed. And she was gone. After that, the letter disappeared. Some said Aldrin burned it. Others said it never existed at all. But one guest swore they saw a new letter days later, resting on a windowsill in the library, this one sealed in blue wax, with no name. And inside? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. But certainly, not early, not forgotten, and never quite on time, just exactly what it needed to be. 17 minutes behind. And always, somehow, right on schedule. Part 14. The key that didn't fit any door. The key was made of brass. Small, unassuming, no longer than a matchstick, with a rounded bow and a long, thin shaft. It had no markings, no teeth cut deep enough to suggest any particular lock. And yet it gleamed faintly, as though it had been polished not by hands, but by time itself. It had no tag, no label, no chain, just a key, resting quietly at the bottom of a shallow drawer in the library desk. No one knew where it had come from. One morning, it was simply there. Arabelle found it first, while searching for a bookmark she'd misplaced. She held the key up to the light, frowned slightly, then tucked it into her pocket without comment. She was the sort of person who didn't believe in accidents, only misfiled moments. She spent the rest of that afternoon trying the key in every known lock in the inn. The cabinet under the stairwell, the drawer in the bar, the locked cellar door behind the kitchen that even Aldrin rarely used. Nothing. It didn't fit, didn't catch, didn't even pretend to turn. That evening, she sat by the fireplace, the key warm from the heat, and said aloud, more to herself than to anyone else, "It's not for anything here." A man nearby, nursing a cup of lukewarm tea, replied, "Maybe it's not meant to open. Maybe it's meant to remind." She didn't ask what he meant, because somehow, she already understood. The key stayed with her for 2 more days. Then it was gone. Not stolen, not lost, simply absent, until someone else found it. A small boy, exploring behind the curtain in room 6, said he saw something shiny tucked inside a crack in the wall. When asked what it was, he only shrugged. It felt like a memory I wasn't supposed to keep. Later that week, Aldrin found the key resting atop the ledger again, quiet, unchanged, indifferent to interpretation. He placed it in a glass bowl beside the front desk. Guests began to notice it. Some picked it up, rolled it between their fingers, turned it over in the light. They always did so slowly, carefully, like it might unlock more than a door. No one ever took it with them. No one could say why. One woman, a retired school principal who stayed for just one night, stared at the key for nearly 20 minutes. When asked if she was all right, she nodded and said, "I once had a friend who carried a key like this around her neck." She said it was the key to her first house. Even after the house was gone. Maybe this one is like that. A way to remember something you no longer have to carry. After she left, the key stayed behind. Still not fitting. Still waiting. Until, one morning, it vanished again. This time, no one saw who took it. But a folded piece of paper had been left in its place. Unmarked. Untitled. On it, a single sentence. The key didn't need to open anything. It just needed to be held. And beside it, a faint imprint in the wood where the key had rested. Shaped not like a door, but like a moment. A pause. A heartbeat. A clock hand poised between minutes. 17 behind. And exactly where it needed to be. Part 15. The chair that faced the wall. In the west corridor of the second floor. Just past room 5 and before the narrow stairs that creaked even when no one walked on them. Sat a chair. It was not tucked into a table. It did not belong to any room. It did not match any other furniture in the inn. It was simply there, facing the wall. Not diagonally. Not toward a window. Directly toward a stretch of plaster and faded wallpaper. Where the sunlight from the nearby window never quite reached. It was a plain chair, dark wood. Spindle back. And a cushion that had long since surrendered its shape. A single thread hung from the bottom of the seat, swaying gently whenever someone walked by. Though there was no draft. No one knew who placed it there. Aldrin said it had always been there. And perhaps it had. Guests passed it often. Most ignored it. A few paused, puzzled by its placement. Some tried to turn it around, to angle it toward the hallway or the light, but every time, it found its way back. The next morning, without fail, it would face the wall once more. One guest, a philosopher in his retirement, sat in it for nearly an hour. When asked what he saw, he said, "Nothing. That's the point. It's a chair for people who need to face what isn't there." A child once dared another to sit in it for a full 5 minutes. The boy accepted, plopped himself down with a dramatic huff, and stared at the wall with a smirk. By the 3rd minute, the smirk faded. By the 5th, he stood up quietly and didn't speak for the rest of the afternoon. Later, he told his sister, "I heard a voice behind the wall. It wasn't scary, just sad. It was waiting for someone who never knocked." Not all who sat there heard voices. Some saw flickers, not images. Exactly, but impressions, like memories that didn't belong to them. A pair of muddy boots left just outside a door. A letter read but never answered. The sound of a breath held too long and let go too late. And always, just below it all, the steady tick of the inn's great clock, muffled. Yes, but present, as though time itself was holding its breath. Just behind the wallpaper, one guest, a woman in her 70s with ink-stained fingers and a cane wrapped in ribbon, sat in the chair every night for a week. She brought no journal, no book, just herself. She would stare at the wall for precisely 17 minutes. Then rise, nod to no one in particular, and go to bed. On her last morning, she left a small envelope beneath the chair cushion. Inside was a single line, handwritten in violet ink. I faced it. It faced back. We are both free now. After that, no one sat in the chair for a while. It remained, patient and unchanged, as the wallpaper around it faded further and the dust gathered where no feet walked. It didn't ask to be understood. It didn't need to. Because some things at the mapmaker's rest weren't about discovery. They were about stillness. About the spaces between questions. About the moments too soft to remember, but too important to forget. And as always, the clock ticked on, 17 minutes behind, and entirely, stubbornly, beautifully, enough. Part 16. The guest who slept in the wrong room, on purpose. The man arrived well after midnight. He carried no luggage, no hat. His coat was damp but not dripping. And his boots made no sound as he walked across the threshold of the mapmaker's rest. Aldrin looked up from behind the bar, not startled, not surprised. He simply waited. I'd like room 4, the man said. Aldrin blinked once, then replied, Room 4 is taken. Room 9. Then, the man said, casually. Aldrin paused. There is no room 9. The man smiled, not cruelly. I know. That was the end of the conversation. Aldrin handed him a key. It bore no number. The man went upstairs without looking back. He did not go to room 1, or 2, or even 8. He turned down a corridor that curved more than the hallway usually did. Paused before a door that didn't exist during daylight hours. and entered a room that did not appear on any map, chart, or record. He stayed there for 3 nights. No one saw him during the day. No one heard him at night. But the room changed. Staff noticed the wallpaper on the nearby walls had begun to ripple slightly, not from moisture, but from memory. The scent of warm cedar lingered in the hallway. A clock in the library ticked slightly louder. And the inn itself, quieted. Not hushed, not tense, just expectant, like a pause before something gentle and irreversible. On the 4th morning, the man came down for tea. He drank it without sugar. Then he asked Aldrin a single question. Have you ever stayed in a room that wasn't yours? Aldrin, after a moment, said, once. I didn't sleep. Neither did I, said the man. But I remembered someone else's dream. And with that, he left. He did not leave money. Or a name. But he left the room unlocked. And inside, on the bedside table, perfectly centered, was a note. It read, I did not belong here. But I was needed. Thank you for making space. The handwriting was familiar, though no one could place it. A curl in the Y. A hesitation before the K. Some thought it looked like Aldrin's. Others said it resembled Arabelle's journal entries. Still others claimed the note changed each time you read it. But the meaning was always the same. That someone had gone where they weren't meant to go, and left things just a little better than they had found them. Afterward, the hallway leading to the room became shorter again. The door faded. The floorboards straightened. The wallpaper quieted. But every so often, when the moon was high and the rain didn't quite fall, guests said they felt a shift in the walls. Like something had rearranged itself gently. A slight exhale. A borrowed room being returned. And always, just faintly, the sound of the old clock ticking through the silence. 17 minutes behind. But, as ever, exactly when it was needed. Part 17. The notebook with pages that changed overnight. There was a notebook on the small table near the library window, brown leather cover. Slightly warped by humidity. No title. No lock. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Not a guest's notebook, not labeled, suggestions, or guest thoughts. Just there. Always closed. Always waiting. Some thought it was a journal left behind by a long-departed guest. Others believed it was a ledger that Aldrin had meant to use but never did. A few even whispered that it had once belonged to the inn itself, that the building had started writing things down when it realized people forgot too much. And what was most curious? The words inside change. Not visibly. Not like watching ink shift on the page. But day to day. The entries were different. A sentence here. A name there. The punctuation might shift. A word rewritten. A line added that hadn't been there before. Or an entire page that had previously been blank would now be filled with gentle script. Not chaotic. Not hostile. Just evolving. Adapting. Remembering. The entries were often small. Mundane things. The kettle sings a little louder on cold mornings. She never knocked. But the room waited anyway. I forgot the name of the road that brought me here. I hope it forgets me too. No dates. No signatures. Only handwriting that felt familiar even when it wasn't. Elsie, when she was still around, once spent an entire morning reading it. Afterward, she looked out the window for a very long time. Then said softly to Aldrin, "It remembers things I didn't tell it." Another guest, a quiet man named Peter, tried to copy an entry down. The next day, when he checked, the page was gone, replaced by a drawing of a cup of tea and the words, "Some things only stay when you stop trying to keep them." One night, during a particularly heavy rain, a guest opened the notebook and found her own handwriting staring back at her. Words she'd written in her personal diary years ago. Long since lost in a move. The phrase was exactly the same, down to the misspelling of the word lantern. She didn't ask how it got there. She just turned the page and kept reading. Aldrin, when asked, never touched the book. "It isn't mine," he would say. "It belongs to whoever needs it." Someone once tried to take it with them. They slipped it into their satchel while no one was looking. Left early the next morning. Before breakfast. 3 hours later, the notebook was back on the table. Open this time, to a single page that read, "You weren't finished." After that, no one tried again. But people still read it. Gently. Respectfully. Quietly. Like visiting an old friend's memory, one they were still sorting out themselves. And the pages kept turning. Slowly. At their own pace. Never fast. Never forced. Always 17 minutes behind the stories they were about to tell. And somehow, right on time. Part 18. The rain that only fell on one side of the roof. The mapmaker's rest had a sloped roof, patched and retiled over the decades with a mixture of slate, cedar shingles, and whatever else happened to be available during the quiet years. From the outside, it looked uneven, almost haphazard, but it had held through wind, time, and more than one winter that overstayed its welcome. What few guests noticed, and even fewer believed, was this. When it rained, it only fell on one side of the roof. Not always the same side. Sometimes it was the north slope, sometimes the south, but never both at once. From inside the attic room, a low-ceilinged nook with a single iron bed, a writing desk, and a window so old it blurred the world like a foggy mirror. One could hear it clearly, the sound of rain. Falling gently, but only to the left, or only to the right. It wasn't a trick of wind. There was no crossbreeze, no overhanging trees to drip unevenly. The gutter system was intact. The building didn't tilt, and yet, the rhythm of the rainfall stayed lopsided, as if the weather had chosen a side. Guests in the attic sometimes found themselves sleeping more deeply when the rain tapped on the eastern side. Others claimed dreams came faster when it chose the west. A woman named Clarice, who stayed during an early spring thaw, wrote in her journal, "The rain came in sentences tonight, but only half a conversation, like someone forgot to reply." Another guest, a meteorologist on sabbatical, tried to document it. He brought instruments, anemometers, even a hand-cranked barometer he'd inherited from his grandfather. He stayed 5 nights. On the 6th, he left a single page of notes taped to the attic door. All measurable conditions are normal, but the sky is clearly choosing. No one removed the note. Aldrin didn't touch it, neither did Arabelle. Over time, the ink faded, but the paper remained, slightly wrinkled from the very rain it described. Some guests took comfort in the uneven sound. It reminded them of rocking chairs, of whispered lullabies, of being alone, but not lonely. One couple stayed during an especially long drizzle that lasted from dusk until mid-morning. They spent the entire night lying in bed, listening to the rain fall against the left half of the roof, and talking quietly about things they hadn't spoken aloud in years. In the morning, they left a small sketch in the attic journal. Just a roof, drawn from above, with raindrops on only one side. They didn't leave names, only a message at the bottom. Sometimes, imbalance is what keeps things standing. Since then, the attic room has been quietly popular. Not requested. Exactly, it doesn't appear in the reservation book, but offered gently to guests who seem to need it. When the rain comes, as it always does eventually, it still chooses a side, and guests still listen to the rhythm, to the quiet division of weather, to the balance that isn't symmetrical, but is somehow still whole. And through it all, even in the attic, the old clock ticks faintly below, 17 minutes behind, but never out of tune with the rain. Part 19. The watch that ticked only when you stopped looking. It was left on the bar one night, a pocket watch. Simple, silver, and slightly tarnished. No chain, no name engraved, no inscription inside the lid. Just a worn velvet lining and a face with Roman numerals. Its minute hand paused precisely between 4 and 5. It made no sound. Aldrin found it during his final sweep of the inn for the evening. He held it for a moment, turned it over, then placed it beside the jar of matches and the empty teacup that no one dared move. The next morning, the watch was open. The minute hand had moved forward one notch. Still no ticking, no winding mechanism that seemed to work. But each time someone left the room, even briefly, the hands would advance just slightly. Some guests thought it was a trick. One even tried watching it continuously for hours. He sat at the bar with the watch in front of him, unmoving, unblinking, certain he could catch it in the act. He didn't, but the moment he blinked, just once, the hand had jumped again. By 1 minute, it became a quiet mystery, a soft amusement. Guests would check in the morning, note the time, and check again after returning from a walk or a nap. Each time, it was a few minutes ahead. And yet, still behind. Always, without fail, the watch was 17 minutes behind the great clock above the mantel. No matter how many minutes passed, no matter how long one left the room, no matter how often one tried to sync them, it was as though the watch wasn't trying to keep time. It was trying to catch up. One guest, An aging novelist named Benton stared at it for a long time before saying quietly, "That's what grief feels like." When asked what he meant, he shrugged. It moves, even when you don't see it, especially when you don't. Another evening, a young woman, a violinist, borrowed the watch for a performance in the common room. She played softly, seated on the arm of the hearthside chair, with the watch resting beside her bow. As she played, the minute hand moved steadily, keeping pace with her notes. When she finished, it stopped. The watch didn't tick again for 3 days. Some began to suspect that it was not measuring time as most clocks did, not in seconds or minutes, but in presence, in attention, in the space between being seen and being forgotten. Eventually, the watch disappeared. No one saw who took it. No one accused. But a week later, it returned, on the mantel, resting beside a folded piece of paper that simply read, "I only wanted to know what it felt like to be watched without being judged." The note wasn't signed. The handwriting was crooked, shaky, as though written by someone who hadn't held a pen in years. Aldrin placed the paper in the guest book, not between the pages, but taped to the inside of the front cover, so it would be seen. Briefly, once, then passed, like the watch, like the glance, like time that only moved when no one was watching. And all the while, the great clock above the fireplace ticked gently on, 17 minutes behind, but always waiting, always listening, even when your eyes were somewhere else. Part 20. The clock that knew when to stop. The great clock above the hearth had always ticked. Slowly, steadily, 17 minutes behind. It had ticked through storms. And through sunlit breakfasts it had ticked while teacups stayed warm. While letters were opened late. While guests stared at walls, windows, notebooks, and rain. It had ticked in silence. It had ticked in memory. But one morning, it stopped. Not with drama. Not with a loud mechanical cough or the snap of a spring. Just stopped. The second hand froze at the 4. The minute hand resting at 6:43. The hour hand uncertain, hovering between the space of before and almost. At first, no one noticed. The fire still burned, the chairs still creaked gently when someone sat down, the library still whispered in its paper voice, even the teacup still glowed faintly on its shelf. But there was something quieter. Not wrong, just different. A few guests looked up and frowned. One reached for their wristwatch, only to find it, too, had paused, not broken, but unwilling to move. Elsie would have known, but she wasn't there. The watch on the bar sat open, unmoved. The room where the rain fell on only one side of the roof was dry. Even room 9, which hadn't appeared in weeks, seemed to linger in the corner of someone's eye. Not opened, but almost remembered. Aldrin stood at the bar. He didn't reach for the clock. He didn't wind it. He just looked up and smiled. "It knows," he said softly, to no one. "It's waiting for us to catch up." That evening, guests gathered in the common room without speaking. They sat by the fire. They listened to the wood crackle. Someone began to hum. Another poured tea. No one checked the time. Because they knew. The clock hadn't failed. It had simply paused. To let everyone else arrive. One by one. At their own pace. A young woman from room 2 wrote a note and placed it on the mantel. "I was always early. And always tired. This is the first time I arrived exactly when I was supposed to." And beneath that, another guest scribbled in pencil. 17 minutes isn't a delay. It's a gift. That night, long after the lights had dimmed and the soft murmur of sleep filled the hallways, the clock ticked again. Once. Just once. Then paused. Not broken. Just resting. Because the mapmaker's rest didn't run on time. It ran on timing. On waiting. On slowness. On letting go. And on the quiet truth that sometimes, the most important part of a journey is when you finally stop rushing. So the clock ticked. 17 minutes behind. But exactly when it needed to. And you, dear listener, who have walked with us through quiet corridors and unread pages, you have arrived too. Not early. Not late. Just right here. Just in time. Part 21. The room that was already clean. It was room 6. Not particularly popular. Not particularly disliked. Guests often described it as plain but pleasant. The curtains were slightly thicker than most, filtering morning light into gentle gold. The bed was soft but creaked if you shifted too quickly. The mirror above the dresser leaned ever so slightly to the left, reflecting the room at a curious angle. as if unsure which version of itself it wanted to remember. But what made room 6 different, what made it quietly remarkable, was that no one ever had to clean it. Not because it stayed pristine. Not because it was unused. But because, somehow, it was always already clean. Bedsheets smooth, pillows puffed, the teacup on the nightstand dry but spotless. Not a trace of dust on the wardrobe's top edge, where even the most diligent housekeepers often forgot to check. At first, Aldrin thought it was coincidence. Then habit. Then perhaps the quiet work of some long-retired guest who returned unseen. Tidying up out of love or boredom. But no matter how often someone stayed in room 6, no matter how messy or meticulous they were, the morning after they checked out, the room appeared untouched. Arabelle once tested it. She spilled flour on the floor before bed, scattered rose petals beneath the sheets, even placed a single red marble behind the door hinge, a trick she used as a child to see if someone had entered. The next morning, the room was spotless. The marble was gone. The rose petals vanished. The flour? Not a trace. And most strangely, the small pad of paper she had left on the dresser now contained a new note. "Thank you for staying tidy." It wasn't her handwriting. It wasn't Aldrin's either. And no one else had entered. Guests reported small sensations in the room. Not cold spots. Not ghosts. Just presences. A tug at the bedsheet that felt more like a tuck. A whisper of lavender in the air, even when no sachets had been placed. The faint sound of sweeping, not loud enough to disturb sleep, but rhythmic enough to be real. One guest, a man recovering from a long grief, claimed that each night, before falling asleep, he heard someone humming, not a melody he recognized, but something gentle, wordless, like a lullaby from a life he hadn't lived. He asked Aldrin who was on staff that late. Aldrin just shook his head and said, "Room 6 looks after itself." Some suspected it was a maid who once lived upstairs, years before the inn had electricity. Some said it was the spirit of a guest who had cleaned obsessively in life and simply never stopped. But the truth felt softer than that. Less haunted, more grateful, as though the room itself had learned to care, not for itself, but for those who passed through. That it wanted to offer peace not through beauty, but through effort. No grandeur, just comfort. And always, as guests stepped out of room 6 and into the hall, they would pass the grandfather clock at the landing. Still ticking, still steady, still 17 minutes behind, but no one minded, because in room 6, time never felt wasted, just quietly folded, like linens, like corners tucked with care, like something already clean before you knew it needed to be. Part 22. The mirror that only reflected mornings. It hung in the hallway between room 2 and room 3. Oval-shaped, framed in tarnished brass, with little floral engravings that had worn smooth from time and touch. It wasn't large, barely big enough to reflect a face and shoulders, but it had a quiet presence. Like an object that knew it had once mattered more than it does now. Most guests passed by it without thinking. Some adjusted their collars. Some fixed their hair. But it wasn't until they tried to use it at night that they noticed something odd. It didn't reflect. Not darkness, not light, not anything at all. It simply became still, like a painting of a mirror. Flat, silent, refusing. No matter how bright the hallway lamps glowed, the mirror would show no image after sunset. Even those who held candles or used the flash of a camera found only the outline of their reflection, never their face. But in the morning, it came alive. Guests who passed it at dawn saw themselves in perfect detail, not flawless. Not polished, but honest. Some said they looked younger. Others older. A few said they looked like versions of themselves they remembered from dreams. One guest, a night shift nurse, said the mirror showed her not tired, but softened. A teacher saw herself as she had looked before her voice changed from years of quiet scolding. A widower said, "It showed me how she used to look at me. I'd forgotten." Arabelle once brought a notebook and sat across from the mirror every hour of the day for 2 days straight. She recorded its changes. 3 a.m., nothing. A dull metallic shimmer. No reflection. 6:12 a.m., faint return. Blurred shapes. Something stirring. 7:43 a.m., fully reflective. Expression appears, more truthful than the one I meant to wear. And then her final note. It doesn't show what we are. It shows what we allow ourselves to be before the day edits us. Some guests tried to cover the mirror at night. A scarf, a towel, a jacket. Every morning, the covering was gone, not on the floor, not folded nearby, just gone, as if the mirror had gently declined the gesture. Others avoided it altogether. It unnerved them, not from fear, but from recognition, as if it might show something too gentle to bear. A letter was once left taped beneath the mirror. No envelope, no name, just folded paper and blue ink. I only look at it at dawn, when I still believe I might be someone worth reflecting. No one claimed the note, but no one removed it either. The paper yellowed, the handwriting blurred, and the mirror continued to show what it showed. But only in the morning. Only when the light was quiet. Only when people hadn't yet decided who they were supposed to be that day. And all the while, behind the wall, just around the corner, the inn's great clock ticked on. 17 minutes behind. Just enough time to see yourself before the world did. Part 23. The guest who didn't remember checking in. Her name was Margaret. At least, that's what she said when Aldrin asked. She had kind eyes and a voice that sounded like someone who often whispered. Even when she didn't need to. Her coat was warm, her suitcase well worn, and her shoes perfectly dry, despite the fact that it had been raining for 3 days. I believe I have a reservation, she said. Aldrin glanced at the book. There was no record, but he didn't question it. He handed her a brass key, room 8. She thanked him softly, as if unsure whether she had earned it. That night, she ate supper alone, a small plate of soup and a corner of bread. She said very little, but smiled often. She read for a while by the fire, then retired early. The next morning, she came downstairs and asked if she'd already paid. You did, Aldrin said gently, though he wasn't certain. On the second day, she spoke with a guest in the library about music. She couldn't remember which instruments she played, but her fingers moved gracefully as she spoke, as if plucking invisible strings. I used to know something about rhythm, she said. I think I still do. On the third night, she left a note on her nightstand. Please remind me if I forget why I'm here. No one knew if it was for herself, or for someone else. By the fourth day, she began to walk the halls. Not aimlessly, but searching. She would pause at each framed painting, each door, each staircase landing, as if waiting for a memory to pass by and wave. Sometimes she would smile and shake her head gently. Not yet, she'd whisper. One afternoon, a younger guest offered to help her find what she was looking for. Margaret placed a hand on the girl's shoulder and said, I'm not looking for anything. I'm just making sure I'm still here. That night, she stood beneath the great clock for nearly an hour. Watching, listening. Finally, she turned to Aldrin and said, It's 17 minutes behind. He nodded. I think I used to be, too, she added, but now I'm right where I should be. She didn't check out. She didn't say goodbye. She was simply gone the next morning. But on the pillow in room 8, someone had laid a folded paper flower, delicate, pale yellow, the kind made from old ledger paper. And beside it, a second note, written in her graceful hand. If I come again, let me arrive slowly. I'd like to remember the forgetting. That day, the wind blew in through the front door even though it had remained shut. The teacup warmed slightly. The clock ticked once, then paused. 17 minutes behind, waiting, as it always had, for someone to catch up. Part 24. The dust that gathered in the shape of words. It began as nothing more than a curiosity. A guest had moved the armchair in the corner of the library to sweep beneath it, not because anyone asked her to, but because she found comfort in tidiness. As she brushed the broom gently along the wooden floor, she paused. There, in the fine layer of dust that had settled beneath the chair, were markings, not random, not footprints or scratches. Words, perfectly shaped, evenly spaced, formed in fine dust like letters pressed into snow. She leaned closer. The message read, Don't forget to rest here. She blinked, looked again, and the words were gone, swept back into randomness by the motion of air. The shift of her own breath. She didn't tell anyone, not that day, but 3 mornings later, someone else, a teacher from room 5, noticed a fine scattering of gray powder on the windowsill near the front staircase. He wiped it away with a cloth, only to find, just beneath the layer, the outline of a sentence. You're not late, just slower than the world expects. After that, people began looking, not urgently, but curiously. Dust appeared in corners where it hadn't before, on the edges of forgotten shelves, on banisters no one had touched in weeks. and in it, faint, fragile, impermanent, were fragments of language. Messages, encouragements, questions, sometimes even answers. One message, scrawled barely visible beneath the desk in room 4. Read, "You're not the first to cry here. You won't be the last. It's okay." Another, above the mirror in the downstairs washroom, said simply, "Straighten your shoulders. The world won't do it for you." And perhaps most curious of all, someone found a full paragraph in the hallway outside the attic, gently curled along the baseboard. Like it had formed itself during the night. The things we carry in silence have weight. This place will hold some of it. If you let it. That's what the corners are for. Aldrin was asked once if he had ever seen the dust right itself. He shook his head. But then he added, "Some words don't need to be written. They're remembered by the room until someone needs them." Guests began to leave their own messages. Not in ink, but by breathing near a windowsill and watching the dust stir. By running a fingertip slowly along the table's edge and whispering a thought into the stillness. Some messages faded, some lingered, some changed, as if rewritten by the inn itself. And on one particularly quiet morning, a guest stood at the base of the main staircase and looked down to find 3 words etched perfectly into the wood-grain floor. Surrounded by nothing but sunlit dust. "I'm still here." She smiled, didn't step on them, just nodded, and kept walking. Behind her, the great clock ticked softly. 17 minutes behind, but always listening, always waiting for the words that didn't need to last forever, only long enough to be seen. Part 25. The goodbye that no one heard. There was no bell above the door. No chime when someone left. People often assumed they had simply not noticed the sound, that it was quiet. Muffled, perhaps hidden in the ticking of the clock or the shuffle of chairs. But the truth was simpler. The mapmaker's rest did not mark departures with sound. Only with stillness. When a guest left, the inn changed very slightly. Not the rooms, not the furniture, but the air. A hush that settled gently over the hallway. A faint emptiness near the fire. A chair pushed in just a little farther than usual. As if someone had risen carefully, not wanting to disturb the others still dreaming nearby. Sometimes, a scent remained. A trace of lavender, pipe smoke, rosewater and old ink. Sometimes, it was an object. A bookmark left between pages of a book the guest hadn't finished. A scarf draped over the banister. Waiting to be remembered. A name scribbled softly at the margin of the guest book. As though written while unsure whether to sign at all. But most often, it was silence. A silence shaped like someone who had finally let go of something. Arabelle once said, "Some people arrive to remember. Others leave to forget. But most, they come to pause." A man who stayed only one night left a sealed envelope under his pillow. Inside was no message. Only a photograph of a lake at sunset. On the back, he'd written, "This is the last time I felt still." A couple, gone before dawn, left 2 empty cups on the windowsill, facing the sunrise. Beneath one was a napkin with the words, "We whispered more in one night here than we did in years." And then there was the door. Near the back of the inn. By the kitchen, the one no one used. Some said it never opened. Others swore they saw it swinging gently on mornings after guests had left. It made no sound, not even a click, but Aldrin always knew when it had been used. That morning, he would dust the ledger. He would polish the empty teacup. He would light the fire, not for warmth, but for welcome, because even goodbyes here were quiet. Even endings asked permission. Even leaving took 17 minutes longer than it should. And that was enough time. To finish the tea. To fold the letter. To remember the name. To forgive yourself for needing rest. And somewhere, as the door eased shut behind them, the great clock ticked on. Still 17 minutes behind. Still waiting. Still promising that even if no one heard you say goodbye, you were heard. Part 26. The man who brought his own time. He arrived wearing 3 watches. One on each wrist. And a third, looped on a chain around his neck. Tucked beneath a threadbare vest that didn't quite button anymore. The first watch was digital, blinking numbers. Always resetting itself. The second was mechanical. Wound so tightly that it ticked louder than the fire. The third was a pocket watch, gold-plated. Engraved, but cracked across the glass like a spiderweb suspended in amber. He spoke quickly, like a man trying to outpace something. "I'll only need one night," he said, then, glancing at his wrist. "Maybe less." Aldrin didn't reply. He handed him a key, room 1, and gestured gently toward the stairs. The man climbed them 2 at a time. That night, guests heard him moving about his room, not pacing, but arranging, placing things, adjusting furniture, opening and closing the curtains. Once, someone heard the distinct sound of several clocks ticking all at once. In the morning, he came down for tea. His eyes were tired, his movements slower. One watch was gone. He didn't mention it, just stared into his cup and said, "You know, time is heavier when you carry it for too long." No one answered. He sat for hours, barely sipping, then rose, climbed the stairs again, and remained in his room for the rest of the day. The second morning, he returned to the common room. The second watch was missing. He looked lighter, not younger, not freer, just a little less tightly wound. He walked the garden path before breakfast, stood in the rain without flinching, sat in the red velvet chair and watched the fire burn all the way down to ash. He didn't check his wrist once. That night, no one heard him stir. On the third morning, he came down with empty hands. No watches, no questions, no urgency. He stood before the clock above the hearth, the one always 17 minutes behind, and looked at it for a long time. Then smiled. He turned to Aldrin and said, "I've been early for everything in my life." It was exhausting. Aldrin nodded once, as if he'd been waiting for that exact sentence for years. The man left that afternoon. Not in a hurry, not by the front door, but by the narrow path behind the garden, the one no one walked unless they were ready to leave something behind. Later, when Arabelle changed the linens in room 1, she found something resting on the windowsill. It was a clock, no hands, just an empty face and a note beside it that read, "I don't need to know what time it is anymore, I just need to know where I am." She didn't touch it, she let it stay, and each morning after that, at exactly 6:43, or thereabouts, the empty clock caught the first sunlight through the curtain and lit up gold. As if it had become, at last, a place rather than a measure. And below it, faint but steady, the great clock ticked on. Still 17 minutes behind, but right on time. Part 27. The window that let the moon in, even when it wasn't there. It was a small window, tucked high in the attic stairwell. No curtains, no latch, just a pane of thick, slightly rippled glass that distorted the outside world into soft curves and cloudy edges, as if the world beyond were only half remembered. Most guests never noticed it. The attic wasn't part of the regular rooms. It wasn't locked, but it also wasn't listed. You had to be looking for something quiet, or trying to escape something loud, to find yourself climbing those narrow stairs. But for those who did, the moonlight came through that window. Always, even on cloudy nights, even when the moon, by all accounts and calendars, wasn't in the sky, even during new moons, or storms, or late mornings when dawn should have already washed away the night. A soft blue glow filtered in, sometimes strong, sometimes pale, always steady. A violinist once stayed in the attic room, a quiet man named Lowell who had lost his ability to perform on stage. He said the moonlight from the stairwell window made his hands remember something his mind had forgotten. He played once, just once, in the middle of the night. Not loudly, not for anyone, and the next morning, he left his bow on the stair, tucked gently beneath the windowsill, as if offering it to the light that had helped him forgive himself. Another guest left a letter behind in the attic. "I sat by this window for 17 minutes. And in that time, I missed everything I used to rush toward. I think I'm ready to walk more slowly now." The window never opened. No breeze passed through it. And yet, guests often felt air moving when they stood beside it, not cold, not warm, just present, like a sigh that belonged to no one, or a breath taken long ago and finally let go. On one occasion, during a particularly overcast week, a child climbed the attic stairs in the middle of the night and called softly to her mother. "Come look." The moon came inside, and there it was. Not a reflection, not a trick, but moonlight, clear, gentle, and exactly enough to see your hands without casting a shadow. Aldrin never explained the window. When asked, he only said, "Some light doesn't come from where you think it does." And guests believed him, because when you stood beside that pane of glass, when the night was quiet and your thoughts were softer than usual, you understood something without needing to name it. That sometimes, what you need to see doesn't arrive when the sky is clear, but when you think there's nothing left to see at all. And through it all, even in the attic, even in the silence of moonlight that shouldn't exist, the great clock ticked below, 17 minutes behind, but gently illuminated, right where it had always been. And always, somehow, shining. Part 28. The book that was always on the same page. It sat near the fireplace. On the low table beside the velvet armchair, hardcover. Bound in green cloth. No title on the spine. Its cover bore only one detail, a small, embossed compass rose with no directions marked. Guests would pick it up out of habit. It looked inviting, slightly worn. Worn to the touch. The kind of book you expect to open into poetry or reflections. Or perhaps a forgotten travelogue from someone who preferred fog to clarity. And yet, no matter who opened it, no matter the time, the day, the guest, the book was always turned to the same page. Page 143. The left side was blank. On the right, a single paragraph. The words handwritten in looping. Delicate script. You are not behind, you are not late, you are simply moving at the speed of your own understanding, you are not missing anything, you are arriving. Guests would read it, pause, close the book and leave it exactly where they found it. Some tried to flip through. The pages turned easily, but each one was blank. Except page 143. It remained constant. Ink unfaded. Paper slightly warm, as if someone had read it just before you did. A guest named Corwin once copied the passage into his journal. He wrote it down 3 times, slowly, carefully, and then placed the journal on his nightstand. The next morning, the words had vanished. Not crossed out, not torn away, just gone as if they had been borrowed and politely returned. He checked the green book again. Still on page 143. Still waiting. Another guest, a woman in her 50s, who rarely spoke, said the book made her cry. Not because the words were sad, but because they were simple. And that, she said, is sometimes harder to believe than anything else. Most things in life, she whispered, ask us to hurry, but this one didn't. No one knew who wrote the paragraph. Arabelle thought it might be Aldrin's handwriting. Aldrin insisted it wasn't. He said, it's from whoever the reader needs most. One child once opened the book and said, that's what my grandmother used to tell me when I couldn't fall asleep. When asked what happened to his grandmother, he looked puzzled, then smiled and said, maybe she moved into the book. No one laughed. No one needed to. Because some things don't need proof. They only need to stay exactly where they are. Quiet, unchanging, ready. And every so often, when someone closed the book and walked away, a whisper of motion stirred the air beside the fireplace, like a breath exhaled slowly by a page that had been waiting a very long time to be read again. Below it, in the stillness of the common room, the great clock ticked on, 17 minutes behind, but always on the same page. Part 29. The step that didn't creak, until you needed it to. There were 81 steps in the mapmaker's rest. Not all in one place, scattered among staircases that twisted at odd angles. Curved when they didn't need to, or stopped short before continuing as landings and half-flights. Most creaked, softly, politely, a worn kind of music, as familiar to the building as the sigh of the wind beneath the eaves or the click of teacups being set gently on saucers. But one step, exactly the 32nd, on the back staircase near room 6, remained silent. Always, no matter who stepped on it, no matter how heavy the tread. Even the heaviest boots or the sharpest heels made no sound there. Some thought it had been repaired better than the rest. Others thought it had been blessed. But most simply stopped noticing after a while, except when it didn't stay silent. Because now and then, on very rare occasions, the step did creak. Not loudly, not jarringly, just enough to be heard. And only when someone needed it to. A guest named Della, who hadn't spoken in 3 days, once paused on the 32nd step and heard the faintest groan of old wood beneath her. She froze, and then, for reasons she couldn't explain, began to cry, not out of fear, but out of release. I just needed something to notice I was still here, she said later, and it did. Another time, a man lost in thought, overwhelmed by a decision he hadn't yet made, said the step, spoke back. Not in words, but in the way it gave under his weight. Just enough to say, yes, that's real, you're real, go on. No one ever heard it twice. Even those who waited, tested, returned with hope or nostalgia. The step stayed silent for them, as if it only had one message per person. And once it had delivered it, the moment belonged to memory alone. Arabelle tried documenting it, of course. She brought a notebook, marked the position, measured the wood, timed her steps. She stepped on it 17 times in a row. Nothing. On the 18th, just as she was about to give up, it creaked softly, and her pencil broke in half. She looked down and smiled. "Fair," she whispered. Some said the step was charmed. Others believed it was listening. Aldrin, when asked, simply said, "The inn speaks, just not in sentences." And guests believed him, because there's something quietly profound about a place that doesn't interrupt, doesn't rush, only waits to respond when you finally need to hear it. The 32nd step remained there, patient and unremarkable, among the others that whined and complained and groaned with age. But it never drew attention to itself. Except when it did, and somewhere below, in the still rhythm of the common room, the great clock ticked on, 17 minutes behind. Right on schedule. And sometimes, just loud enough to let you know you had been heard. Part 30. The room that waited without being booked. It had no number, no key, no listing in the guest ledger. But it existed, sometimes, between room 3 and room 4, where the hallway dipped just slightly and the wallpaper changed pattern for reasons no one remembered. There would occasionally appear a door. Not locked, not marked, just there. It was the color of dusk, not gray, not blue, not quite shadow. The knob was smooth brass, cool to the touch even on summer afternoons. Guests didn't ask for the room. They didn't know to. But when someone needed it, truly needed it, the door appeared. Inside, the room was different for everyone. A woman named Laura, who arrived without luggage and left without a sound, once described it as a place where the silence didn't press in. A boy of 13, whose parents never came inside with him, said, "It felt like someone had already built a blanket fort and left it just for me." An old man with tremors in his hands said, "I didn't shake while I was in there. Not once. No one stayed more than one night. And no one ever saw anyone else enter or leave it." The room didn't always appear as a bedroom. Sometimes, it was a study, a greenhouse, a bench by an imaginary lake, where wind moved only when you thought of someone you missed. There was always a chair. And a sound, faint and distant, of something turning. Not music, not a machine, just turning, as if a great key were being slowly wound. Far beneath the floorboards, inside the heart of the building itself. A guest named Eleanor once wrote a letter inside the room, a letter she would never send. When she stepped back into the hallway, it was no longer in her hand. She panicked, returned to the spot, and the door was gone. But that evening, tucked beneath her teacup on the bar, was the envelope, unstamped, unsealed, and inside, the last sentence read, "Thank you for waiting for me before I knew I needed to arrive." Arabelle marked the spot in her notes as the listening room. Aldrin called it the room with no hour. And others didn't name it at all. Because names are for things you expect to find again. This room was not that. It came when needed, left when not, and never asked anything in return, except that you sit down. Even for a moment, and let go of the time you thought you had lost. Because time wasn't lost in that room. It was simply waiting, with the same patience as the inn itself. With the same silence as the dust that spoke. With the same rhythm as the old clock below. Still ticking. Still 17 minutes behind. Still the only clock in the world that didn't ask you to catch up, but invited you to rest.